Good evening, folks. I can see we've got a few coming in now, so it's nice to see you. And if I can ask you as you're coming in to go to menti.com and put in the code that is on the screen. Hopefully you can see my screen share. So the code is 2767307, which I will just put in the chat as well. Which I can't put in the chat because we've set it up without a chat. Right. Oh, there we go. I've got it. Thank you, Niels. So menti.com and then 2767307. And we will get started with the first question. So welcome to everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. And thank you ever so much to Poppy, Liz and Niels for coming along this evening. And thanks to those of you who've submitted your questions already. We're just going to start with a bit of an overview of where you're at the moment. So participants, as I said, if you go to menti.com and put in the code that you can see on the screen and in the chat. And the first question, if you can submit your answers, how would you define your grazing system? Got a couple of folk. We've got 7 people so far, so we've got a mix of one person set stocking, a bit of rotational, a bit of mob grazing. I'll just give a moment to see if anybody else wants to contribute. We've got someone in the chat saying they're conservation grazing, but they can't input into the Menti thing. No worries. And someone else has said disorganized. Right, let's go on to the next question. So we've got different types of grazing system. What are you managing for? And you can select as many as you like. What are you managing for in your grazing?
Oh, the blue dot. Wherever the blue dot goes. You can just imagine Stallone saying that.
Oh, interesting. So we've got mostly species diversity, a bit of animal growth, and also some grass productivity. That's an interesting mix. All of the options. Thanks, Alistair. I can see you've just put a comment in there. Right, and then we'll go to the next question. Have you got a comprehensive grazing plan for 2021? There was a very confident yes just flew in there, so that was good to see. And quite a few partials. Oh, we've got 3 yeses. This is fab. And we're just going to move on to the last question. What are your key concerns for grazing this year? So are there things that you're worried about, concerned about? And you can just type in your answer. So you've got drought. A slow spring, making money. I think that's, yeah, an interesting one. So having enough grass all year round. Lungworm, grazing to promote soil carbon and measuring it. Wet ground for lambing, stocking density versus grazing availability. Concerns about the impact of hot, very, very hot and dry springs. but not so worried about dry summers. Integrating sheep into the cattle system and wet summer drought. We've got somebody in the chat saying how to make hay while mob grazing.
Probably want
Lamb
to take the
growth.
cows out first.
Say that again, Niels.
You probably want to take the cows out first.
Yeah. Lamb growth and ewe post-weaning BCS, back end of winter, and having enough grass for a slow spring and enough hay all year round. That's fantastic. Thanks ever so much for contributing, folk. I'm just going to stop sharing the screen. And I think that gives us a really clear idea of some of the concerns that people have got. So that's good to know. We're going to run this evening as a Q&A. We've got the chat open, but if I could ask you to put your questions in the Q&A box rather than the chat, just so that I can keep on top of them and I don't miss them. And what we will, we've had a couple of questions that have been emailed in. So we're going to start with those, and then we will come to some of the things that have been picked up through the Menti. But before we come to the questions, I just wanted to ask each of our panelists, at this time of year, as we're just coming into the beginning of spring, what are the things that are sort of on your mind at the moment in terms of grazing for the year? So Liz, if we could start with you.
Yeah, so a lot of the time at the moment, I'm talking to people about sort of pasture covers, so how much grass is coming out of the winter into spring. It's always a bit of a tense time in terms of just balancing that with hopefully growth that we always think is coming. We were lulled into a false sense of security with some nice days last week, and all of a sudden it's gone back to March. So just talking people through options of dealing with not quite as much grass as they would like, and in terms of supplementation with fodder beet or haylage at certain times, and also a lot in terms of planning lambing rotations for those outdoor lambers. So yeah, mainly sort of turnout, hoping that grass is going to grow in a lot of times, and I think at the moment I'm doing quite a bit of sort of spring feed budgets, so just getting people a bit more confidence that this time will pass and that we will have enough grass in a couple of weeks.
Brilliant, thank you. Niels, do you want to just reflect on what you're sort of thinking about this time of year in terms of grazing?
Yeah, okay. So that definitely is the sort of perennial question of sort of when to turn out, for example, when it's dry enough, when there's enough covers, for example. So I think sort of my response to that is really sort of like make your plan and make your decisions in context. So try not to think of just the sort of the next step, if you like, because actually, you know, it's possible to sort of sacrifice a field. It's possible to do some feeding out, for example. So there's a lot of ways to sort of like kind of sort of hedge your bets without, you know, sort of ruining the grazing platform, if you like. But, you know, it's really about sort of planning for the whole year, or at least for the upcoming rotation. So having some plans in place that you can see visually and discuss with your team. And then you've got something to refer to, as opposed to just something gospel, you know, again. So it's something that we're going to want to make decisions in context and make decisions for the whole, as opposed to just the upcoming. And otherwise, try and get the sort of monitoring stuff in place. There's still a bit of time now before going out. So, you know, have an idea of what monitoring practices you want to do and when they're going to be done, basically. So you don't sort of they don't end up sort of falling by the wayside. And there might be, you know, just putting some extra clips on the quad, for example, or, you know, some slots on the quad just where you can put particular tools to have with you, for example. So, yeah.
Brilliant. Thanks, Niels. And Poppy, what are you thinking about other than lambing starts next week?
Yeah. Similar lines to Liz and Niels. Definitely think it's worth going out and gauging your grass supply on the farm, whether you're marking the centimeters on the welly boot and using that to understand what you're coming through the winter with, like Liz said. If it's low, start thinking about how to build grass supplies, and if it's high, then start thinking about what your plan is with grazing that. I also think another gauge to look at is soil temperatures. So grass starts growing over 5 degrees. So keeping an eye and keeping a track of that. So it feeds into what Neil was saying about monitoring. I mean, it might not be And if it's your first year doing it, it might not be of immediate use this year, but it just helps you keep your eye in future years. Our soil temperatures were reached above 5 degrees in the 18th of March this year, and how that panned out in future years, you can compare with it. So yeah, just looking at all the signs to be ahead of the game.
Brilliant. That's great. Thanks, Poppy. So we're going to start with some questions. And if I can just remind participants that this is very much about a Q&A session. So we're going to rely on you submitting your questions through the Q&A option at the bottom of your screen. So please do get your questions in there so that we can ask them. We're going to start with a question that was emailed in that was particularly about mob grazing. And this was somebody who has, so I think this was Stephen, so Stephen Alexander, I think he's in the call, and wanting to ask, they have the intention of trying mob grazing, and it's a semi-herbal lay. So what would the ideal stocking rate be for Dexter cows with calves at foot, so a smaller breed? The ideal size of paddock, and how often would you expect to then change that paddock? They're currently running 35 cows with calves at foot, weaning at 9 months as naturally as possible to avoid stress. And whilst they intend to continue a more conventional system of rotation for the replacement heifers and beef steers, they want to think about how they can integrate a mob approach on some of the other land with the cows and calves. And they do mention as well dry early summers and wet late summers, so quite a change within that summer period. So Liz, do you want to give your thoughts on that first, and then we'll come to Poppy? Oh, we can't hear you, Liz.
That might help. Sorry. In terms of, is there any more information about area available for that? I don't know whether Stephen wants to send a bit more information in.
Yeah, Stephen. Well, maybe Stephen, do you want to send a bit more information in via the chat if you can?
And also, I'm just asking more questions back in terms of just their clarification in terms of what their definition of mob grazing is. So is it leave a third, trample a third, eat a third, or is it more non-selective? So I would a bit more information in terms of what their ambition is, and the reality, which is with those sort of approaches, the more frequent moves. So I would suggest daily shifts. So and I think Poppy has done some calculations in terms of the sort of the stocking rates. But yeah, I would like a little bit more information.
Yeah,
that's great. Poppy, do you want to give your thoughts?
Yeah, I think it's really difficult. It always is. We always are struggling when people ask for stocking rates on different farms, because we really struggle to know, like he's specified, dry early summer, wet late summer. It's really difficult for us to gauge what their grass growth is. So just so a little bit of a get out clause there. But I think yeah, you can't be too prescriptive. I think you either work on what paddock size is suitable for you and use that as your starting point, or how frequently you want to shift. I've just plugged in some figures, and really please just take this as a guide into some feed budgeting spreadsheet that I've got, and we're working on a very rough conservative estimate of grass growth through the summer. I'm working out that it probably require 25 hectares for that group of animals, and that's on the basis of leave a third, trample a third, and eat a third. So a very quick start, but always say be flexible. If they're seeming hungry, if they're not getting enough, then you've got to adapt, or the vice versa. Yeah.
And I suppose it also depends on how much they've built up now.
Yeah.
Do you mean in terms of how much they've got to build some of those covers up?
Yeah.
I've not seen that any further information has come in, but do you want to just talk a little bit, Poppy, about the tools that you would use? So what you were using to give you that information, other than obviously your vast experience?
Oh, it's so we do feed budgeting, and it's a very simple concept. You do it, for those that feed concentrates, bag of concentrate required a day, and that's all you're doing. You're weighing up demand and supply. At grass, we have rough estimates of what different classes of stock require. So from 1.5% of their body weight to 4% of their body weight as a rough range. I plugged in that cows and calves require 1.8% of their body weight. And I'm estimating they're 400 kilo cows. And then I've estimated what the grass growth is and looked at the two to understand what sort of area they'll require. So that's feed budgeting. We could probably, Liz and I and Niels could probably do a whole day on feed budgeting. So I'll not bore you too much with it.
Maybe there'll be some other questions that come in about with more specifics about feed budgeting. Niels, is there anything you want to add on that at all in terms of the planning the mob grazing?
Yeah, I guess probably just to clarify, like Liz is saying, you know, and for me, is it stocking rate you're after or stocking density? Given that you're asking about cell sizes, suggests perhaps it's stocking density that's more the consideration, given that you've already got the stock. So I'm assuming that you sort of like your stocking rate is kind of, that's already decided, if you like. But yeah, I mean, I guess that the main thing is that if you're on daily moves, then you probably are going to be having sort of a fairly selective graze that's taking place. So just monitoring the evenness of the utilization post grazing. And if there is quite a pronounced range, then you might want to tighten up and move more frequently, or else look at topping basically, because otherwise you, again, as you get into the season further down the line, you can end up with kind of quite a proportion of the pastures that are going senescent, and it's sort of this whole kind of range, which we don't really want basically. Is sort of suboptimal, if you like, but it can still produce decent gain. So again, it depends on what your objectives are here. So, you know, more questions for you.
And I guess there'd be something also, I mean, it was clear in that question that the breed was Dexter's, but there would also be something maybe about the breed of cattle and the availability. And so, you know, thinking about particular breeds that get fat on fresh air, like we have, that, yeah, you might not be worried so much about some of that senescent material, but actually if you've got maybe a breed that could really do with more high performance swards, then that might be something to take into consideration. Just kind of to add into the question, we've had a question from John Thorns come in. Is a third the best option? What about moving twice daily and eating 75% plus with a 100 tonne per hectare plus stocking rate?
I quite like the non-selective grazing approach. I think it makes more sense in my head than this trampler third. I think, yeah, it's still about animal impact. And so that density is needed to get that and to get that utilization. But there's also, followed on from your point, which is making sure those animals are coping with that system. So it's also monitoring them, and as you said several times, which is monitor the behavior to make sure they're settling in that system and adjusting area accordingly. It comes back to what your objective is. So the lever third, trampler third may supercharge organic matter. It also may not. So I don't think just because you're trampling on top doesn't mean you're building organic carbon any quicker. So yeah, it's worth considering other options. Niels, sorry, I may have stolen it.
No, Niels. It's good. I was agreeing with you whilst shaking my head.
That's good. Mixed messages.
Niels, do you want to add to that? Do you want to add to that at all, Niels?
Just to clarify John's question, you've put stocking rate there. I'm assuming, again, was referring to stocking density in this instance. That's what I'm imagining what we're referring to. And yeah, I mean, I think the sort of like the way that it's described, the low utilization, the 1/3 rule, if you like, is normally to optimize sort of animal performance, basically by allowing them to. But when we go down to the 1/3 utilization, they are being selective. Yep. You know, if you know anyone that sort of questions, you know, like, oh, we're just going to get them out there and they're going to skim the top. That doesn't happen. Basically, the cows didn't get the memo. Yeah, they're going to eat those ones they like the best, and they're going to eat them right down, basically. And those that they don't, they're going to leave. So this is where you get the unevenness. And again, that can be fine. You know, now and again, basically, and it can be fine, you know, sort of probably early in the season, basically. Once you get into the middle of the season, then yeah, you can end up with this big range, basically. So you basically end up overutilizing your best grasses, underutilizing your worst grasses in any selective situation, basically. And again, if you're just looking at daily live weight gain and not looking at stocking rates, that would look great on paper, but it ain't going to translate to the bottom line. So the key advantage with the sort of non-selective is that that is optimizing landscape function, basically. Again, grass plants are adapted, well, sort of clump forming perennial grasses are adapted for heavy defoliation. It's in fact what keeps them growing, basically. They just need correct rest. And by moving to a high utilization, we can end up doubling the rest periods just straight off the bat. If you go from 1/3 to 75%, you're basically holding them in the pastures for twice as long. And that builds more rest periods in front of you. As Liz was saying, yes, there's much more impetus to monitor animal performance, animal or condition, basically. Really, we shouldn't be seeing any changes in condition. If you're seeing that happen, you're waiting a little bit too long, basically. So in this situation, the advice is to make daily dung scores. So, we'd be probably for us, we'd be monitoring scouring. Us over here in the sort of the wet, warm parts of the world, basically, we're likely to see like too much protein going into the animal. And if they're regularly scouring, then that's obviously going to be like taking condition off and actually just like reducing the efficiency of the intake. So that's where either shifting more frequently or offering some kind of supplement, basically, to sort of balance the ration. And straw seems to be the simplest option, basically. So that can either be ad lib if it's not particularly severe, the kind of like runny poo, basically. But if they've got full-on dairy cow back ends, then one thing that people often do is put them on a straw break. So you basically feed them straw for the first move. And it might be the first half of the day or might be the first quarter of the day. So you're making sure that they're filling the rumen with a nice buffer, got plenty of fiber in there, then they can go forward and intake, a good amount of protein and still maintain good performance, basically.
Thanks, Niels. And Poppy, do you want to add to that and maybe consider another question that we've had at the same time, which is from Will, who's doing non-selective with the cows, which is great, but do you think yearlings do better being allowed to leave some?
As in reducing the utilization. Sorry, non-selective meaning like basically, I've not heard that term before, actually. Is that more just like increasing the utilization? So it's not.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
So they're eating it all down almost.
Yeah.
To
Fair enough.
low residual.
Yeah. I'm always for increasing utilization. Like I completely agree with Niels and Liz that that's the better means in terms of increasing the performance per hectare. Absolutely. Now remind me what Will's question was. Sorry.
Yearlings.
Yeah, he was asking about yearlings and do they better? Do better?
I mean, it's a tricky one actually, because as Neil said, you if you want high performance stock, you actually want to give them choice. You want to allow them to be selective. So either you're managing it as a short, leafy, consistent high energy sward, or you're allowing them to be selective and then perhaps grazing down tighter with another class of stock.
That's great. Sorry, go on, Niels. Did you want to? I was
going to say the one thing I probably would add, just to get the Poppy sort of mooting kind of leader follower system there, and I think that is indicated. But actually, I think the typical is that the lower class stock follows straight after, and I think again, depending on the preceding stock type and the stock numbers and these kinds of things, we can end up having a lot of fouling in the pasture ahead of them, so that the following stock basically A will be exposed to all of those intestinal parasites, and B will leave a lot of pasture untouched. So you won't really be sort of achieving your non-selective goals, basically. And that's the other sort of issue of like trying to leave them in longer to get them to clean up, basically. You're always sort of fighting against that sort of fouling sort of issue. So if we are operating a leader follower, it does suggest that there is sort of extended or full rest between each class, basically.
So as in what, a month's rest? How long a rest are you?
Niels, I'm aware. Oh.
Oh.
Did you get that, Niels?
No.
What sort of rest would you advocate then, as in?
Well, it's just normally a full rotation. So whatever the rotation is you're working on currently, so that full rest period basically.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
I mean, the only really limiting factor is that there's no squared off tips on the grasses. So from that point onwards, you can get back onto it basically. But you know, sort of the longer the better, really.
Niels, I'm aware that you're going to have to leave us in a second due to another commitment. So there was a question from Chris Rumming about, would you stick with the idea of high utilization and maximizing rest, even if heading into potential drought?
That's a good question. I think, I mean, the potential drought is, we can drop the word potential, I think now, basically. I think we're sort of like, that's the reality. We come out of our wet season basically, and we'll go straight into dry periods. And because our pasture soils are sort of suboptimal, you know, we've got very poor infiltration, so there'll be actually quite limited soil moisture going into the dry periods, even though you've had sort of like muddy winters. Basically, there's bog all in there and usable for the plants basically. So that's, I think it's part of a sort of a wider sort of conversation, but certainly sort of shutting up whole sections and planning to graze them as standing hay effectively. I probably would say that is sort of, you know, being prepared to do that and having stock that can do well on that is probably a bigger question. And then once then the situation, we can deal with that. I guess probably maybe Chris's sort of like inference is you want to try and keep more of the grass green. So we might be going round more rapidly, for example, to sort of check that growth, if you like. So some of the suggestions is that you'd basically shut up half the farm, and half of the farm you rotate around with. So you're still working with high utilizations, but you're working on a smaller grazing platform. So you end up with a shorter grazing period, and then you shift on to the deferred forage, basically. Those are the types of systems that people sort of like suggest. And I think that works well in a drought situation, actually. But yeah.
Brilliant. Thanks, Niels. Liz, I just want to come to you to ask a bit more about kind of preparing for a dry period and preparing for potential drought. So sort of Ed's asked, what sort of covers should we be leaving during and coming into a dry period?
To continue the theme, I need Ed to explain what grazing system he runs. So the answer to that is a little different depending on what he's trying to achieve from that grass. A lot of the reality, which is forecasting how much of that dry spell's coming, which is always difficult, but also the idea of slowing down the rotation is key. So in terms of Niels talked about how in a mob grazing situation, you're trying to allocate certain areas. In a sort of a more rotational grazing system, it would be supplementing in, so hay or silage going into those fields to help just slow that rotation down, to give as much opportunity for the grass ahead to maintain its cover. What we're always trying to do is ensure there is grass protecting the soil from basically burning out, like moisture being burnt out from sunshine. So we're always trying to maintain as much cover as possible, but it is potentially by sacrificing certain areas of that farm where they're being supplemented.
And that I can see Niels is going to have to disappear. So and just Ed's come back to say 3-day shifts, ewes and lambs. So what sort of covers would you be leaving?
Take it away, Liz.
I thought you
so
this comes back to where your priorities are. So ewes and lambs, we would never be asking them to work that hard anyway. So particularly depending on where they are in the lactation, we talk about doing residuals down to 1500. We might be flexible with that just to ensure that their intakes are maximized, particularly in early lactation. So it comes back to an element of monitoring that pasture cover, so we know what's happening and what's coming. And so if supply and demand are starting to be mismatched, we can make decisions earlier. So what tends to happen is people run around rotations quicker because they're running out of grass, and run out of grass quicker. So it is this idea of, as grass slows, we have to slow the rotation. And so that's a combination of monitoring and a bit of experience of dealing with that dry. I'm not calling it a drought because I've seen the pictures of Australia, but in terms of it is an element of monitoring, particularly if you're in those higher risk areas.
And this idea of slowing the rotation. So for those folk who are maybe set stocking or kind of thinking about, what does that mean? Poppy, can you talk a little bit about, what is slowing the rotation? How would you know when to do that? And what are good ways of doing that? Potentially also if you don't have the ability to bring in additional supplementary forage.
Yeah, so it's basically increasing the rest period. And I often think I'm going to go back into sort of old measurements, but like looking at the centimetres on entry to the fields, you're targeting for sheep, ewes and lambs around 8, maybe it's for cattle around 10. And if it's not reaching that on entry, that's your indication that you're moving round quicker than the grass is growing. So you're trying to slow down basically to try and tie in with the grass growth, and feeding, bringing in additional area or destocking are all means in which you can slow it down. Absolutely. And just to go back to I remember going around the country 2018 when it was dry and people were saying rotational grazing doesn't work because people were struggling, but mainly because they'd got to quite a high stocking rate. So yeah, they were struggling, but they had much better control over what they were leaving behind. And they did learn, 5 centimetres, no less, for good recovery. And they did learn from their mistakes when they went too low, and it took longer to recover.
And it is as I mentioned, it's trying to protect most of that farm and realise that some of those fields may be lower than you need them to be, but you're trying to protect a wider bit.
Yeah.
And this is like overly dramatic statements. Rotational grazing isn't, but I appreciate now it hasn't rained for a couple of weeks. People are thinking about dry, but we are generally talking worst case scenario situations.
Yeah, absolutely. Be prepared
not
for every
panic,
eventuality. Be prepared for all the eventualities and have multiple contingencies. And Ali, as correctly, he's talked about the concept of untoward acceleration that Andre Voisin talks about. This kind of thing of the grass is growing, so let's crack on. We're actually, slowing down. And so on the converse of that, we've talked about slowing down in a drought. If we have a very wet summer, what would you be advising in terms of how people start managing that? Liz, do you want to give your thoughts?
It's again back to the infamous my obsession with supply and demand. So it is about understanding and the advantage of doing something involving measuring grass, so whether it's tracking centimetres as Poppy suggested or kilos of dry matter, but in terms of it just gives information a couple of weeks earlier than we think. So if we know the trajectory of that pasture cover is going upwards, we can start thinking about bringing in or taking out fields for silage or hay. We can think about bringing in extra animals, or do you mean if we're really confident we can buy in a whole new stock class and want to graze some cattle in this summer. So it is but a lot of that is maintaining pasture quality for the priority animals. So if we're going to lose quality on a couple of places, not over the entire platform. So it is wherever possible is shorten your rotation, so remove area out of your rotation and keep the quality within it. So yes, and that it means that sometimes that, depending on where you are in the year, it doesn't have to be cut for silage. It could be a standing hay crop or deferred grazing. It just gives you loads of options if it's in a certain area rather than across the whole farm. And actually what that does is lose quality for lambs particularly, or growing stock later in the season.
Excellent. Is there anything you want to add to that, Poppy, kind of preparing or dealing with wet weather if it comes?
No, I think I'm a big fan of deferred grazing. We had a talk with Ag Research and their research on deferred grazing in terms of the pasture persistency, the pasture productivity later on. Yeah, I think it's a really good approach without needing to spend diesel on cutting anything. Standing hay, fantastic.
And I think sometimes that people can spend quite a lot of money putting in other crops, so brassicas or westerwolds or other things, and actually a decent deferred grazing planned well can yield as much and with hardly any cost.
Excellent. I'd be keen if anyone, we'll move on to another question, but if anyone is wanting to know a bit more about deferred grazing, then do pop your questions into the Q&A, because I know it's something that is increasing in interest for people. So if you've got specific questions, do put them in. Meanwhile, probably a good one to come to you, Poppy, first, from Ali. He'd like to know your thoughts on a quick skim rotation prior to lambing, just in order to get nutrients and energy in versus just kind of keeping on with the, with the kind of maybe keeping them on a bit longer. Lambing is starting on the 26th of this month. Drift lambing covers ranging from 1,200 to 3,000, but there is less of it at 3,000 than he would like. So do you have any thoughts on that kind of quick skim?
Yeah, well, I need to know what his average covers are. It sounds like his covers are getting pretty high. I don't know. He's saying to 3,000, but I don't know. He's not got he's got a couple of weeks. Yeah, I think it's always a good idea to do a quick skim if you've got decent covers there, because it grazes off that winter dormant material and it stimulates more growth, and it's a good pre-lambing feed as well.
Brilliant. Okay, thank you. Liz, did you want to add to that?
Oh, you're mute, I think. Can't hear you.
Sorry, I have a special button to stop. Anyway, it's not that special because it doesn't work very often. Anyway, but I think it's also back to loads of questions, but understanding how he's managing his singles, because some of those fields are ideal for doing, doing those singles are absolutely fine at 1,200-1,300 and just can be. So it's also understanding the makeup of the different groups he's got available, and doing it. And 3,000 is lovely to have, but actually really difficult to manage from a utilization perspective when you're starting. So I think there would be a major advantage to take some of them off in a rotational way before you set stock.
Yeah, definitely with using lambs, 3,000 will be tricky, yeah.
So I'm just going to come to a couple of the things that were raised as key concerns. Then we'll go back to the question that we'd had emailed in, and then we maybe have had some more Q&A questions come into the Q&A panel. So some of the key concerns that people had identified were, I mean, some of the ones like making money, maybe we can't help with that, but and if we all had the answers, then we'd be well away. But somebody's asked about grazing to promote soil carbon and how they would measure it. Liz, you mentioned about soil organic matter earlier and, kind of trampling. Do you want to just give your thoughts on that?
So a lot of the sort of regenerative approaches, which for me, mob grazing sort of fits in one of the tools that we would use, has been developed in a lot of places where they have low carbon or organic matter levels. So we're talking like 2s and 3s really in terms of organic matter percentage. And the idea of that is it stimulates this big increase in organic matter, both through basically root exudates, but also this trampling effect. So the ambition is that it has the same impact on soils here. Sometimes it's being used on soils which have higher organic matter already. So it won't have that. It will build, but probably not as dramatically on already really depleted soils. In terms of measurement, there's a range of techniques available to measure organic carbon, so loss and ignition being an example and relatively cheap and commonly available. The key with all of it appears to be whichever technique you choose, just stick to that technique. And in reality, we're looking at probably a measurement once every 5 years. So there's also a lot of techniques that suggest they build carbon quicker than that, but in reality, a lot of soils don't change that rapidly. So most of the advice is actually to monitor it once every 5 years for organic carbon, more frequently for nutrients if it can fit into a permanent pasture nutrient soil sample as well in terms of timing.
That's great, Liz. Poppy, are there other sort of soil sampling methods that you would encourage people to consider thinking about beyond just measuring carbon once every 5 years through LOI or something?
Yeah, I mean, I always think just digging, Liz and I used to do this all the time, digging soil pits and looking at the soil structure, looking at the amount of worms that are in the pit, just getting your eye in smells, colours, all the rest, just checking that activity is working as it should be. In terms of other soil tests, I mean, you can look at kind of indicators of biological activity, potential mineralizable nitrogen, things like that as well. Yeah, there's nothing better than just looking at it yourself, I think. First.
Yeah, it's really
Is-
interesting. You talked about getting your eye in, like
Yeah.
both of you have talked about that kind of power of observation. So it seems like that's definitely a key theme. Sorry, Liz, you were going to ask a question.
No, I think I completely agree with Poppy, which is tracking and getting to know those fields. So it is, there are resources from HCB and others, which is helping people track what that soil health is doing. There's a range of tests for biological sort of indicators as well, but I think and the challenge sometimes is there's lots of information, but not a lot of, well, what do I do about it? So we can gather loads of numbers, but actually what next? And that bit is the bit that sometimes is missing from some of those tests. So if you're going to invest in those tests, make sure it comes alongside with some advice about what to do with it when you're presented with quite a complicated sheet full of numbers sometimes.
And probably an opportunity there just to plug the PFLA regional groups, because it might be interesting if you're working with other members in the same region and you've been getting those tests done and you're doing those observations, to then use that community that's going to develop through the development of these regional groups to have those conversations and say, this is what we're finding, what do you think? So yeah, just thought I'd get that quick plug in there as we're seeing those groups pop up across the country at the moment. So let's go to the other question that we had emailed in. And this was quite specific and had us looking at different types of flower species. So thank you ever so much to Jan for this. But Jan asked, they've got 100 acres of wildflowers, which I can imagine it must be very beautiful, which is a lot of knapweed, yellow rattle, a number of vetches, wild thymes, hoary ragwort, common spotted orchids, and one field that has become problematic with fleabane, which is taking over, but the cattle are not keen on it. So there was a question about reducing the fleabane, and then a further question about ragwort. But let's tackle the fleabane question first. Poppy. Or Liz. Sorry.
Or ask the audience.
On my screen. Yeah.
I'm just going to hold my hand up and say this is totally outside my area of expertise, completely and utterly. I had a quick search earlier, and we saw it. Look, we saw it likes damp habitats, it likes wet areas. So ways to address those wet areas, I guess, to try and reduce its competitive advantage in that area, and doing things like we've mentioned, mob grazing, deferred grazing, improving the infiltration of water in these sort of more natural ways, or otherwise, looking at drainage and things like that might help. But I really do struggle with this one, sorry.
Yeah, I can go with Poppy, which is, this is not my natural tendencies, but I would, in terms of if the cattle are not eating it, then options would involve cutting and removing, maybe not for silage. I mean, you won't be able to feed it back to the cattle, but certainly removing it from that field would weaken that plant, as it would do with other sort of plants you don't want in certain places. And I think it would be interesting to know if there are other plants in that field, or whether it has truly dominated it. And so if you keep removing it, will other plants start to sort of balance itself out? But yeah, it's a sort of reverse question, as if what's causing it to dominate. So is it that there's a drainage issue? Is it a nutrient issue? And then I would also ask the question, what do you want that field to do? So if it is about it's about being paid to make it look like it is, then you've achieved your aim. If it is to get greater live weight gain off it, then there's another series of options to consider. But if it is a problem, then silaging, removing it, composting it would be a route I'd go down.
And interestingly, Fidelity has just said in the chat, if you Google it, which is exactly what we did, that there's lots of good things about it, which we found was that actually it can kind of help keep insects, and hence the name Fleabane, it can help keep them away. So maybe learn to love it, and maybe to go along with what Chris has suggested about high density trampling the Fleabane, because potentially then you're getting, where it's been trampled, you're getting the benefits of that kind of repellent properties. And yeah, interesting, Patrick has said that there's tons of it at NEP, and we did think that Jan's field sounded like some kind of smaller version of NEP, which I'm sure is lovely, but that they do have it there, and nothing seems to eat it, but the autumn grass does come through underneath. So again, it's that seasonal planning of maybe think about what you're going to use those fields for later in the year, keep them out of your rotation earlier on possibly. It was a good one for us all to have a think about, so thanks Jan. So Was there anything else? Did either of you want to add anything to that at all?
And we also didn't answer the question about hoary ragwort.
You're right, we didn't.
Again, probably because we don't know the answer to that, but I would conclude that I'm not sure it's the thing I would like my cattle to be eating. It's that the toxins build by accumulation. So again, I would like to just know a bit more in terms of what the animal performance was. Was there any sign of photosensitization last summer when they were grazing it? Any behavior change in those cattle indicating there was something not quite right with them?
Yeah, and this was, sorry, I didn't read it out. I was going to split the question into two, which was that apparently Jan's been told that hoary ragwort is less toxic than common, and is it an issue for the cattle to eat it? I think we also maybe had a thought that it sounds like it's a very diverse pasture, so there's potential that the cattle are accessing something that is managing that toxicity and helping them to manage that, but actually probably would want to be talking to a vet about that and getting a bit more detail. Poppy, was there anything you wanted to add to that?
No, I think you covered it well. Thank you.
Okay.
Took the words out my mouth. You both did.
Interestingly, we've had feedback from Patrick Toe, said that it has the same toxins as Comet ragwort, but it's not on the Injurious Weeds Act. So obviously it has some benefit, possibly. I don't know enough about hoary ragwort. Okay, just going to come back to the questions that have been submitted during the session. So this is coming back to standing hay, deferred grazing. Polly's asked, can you use it for sheep, or is it only suitable for cattle? Poppy.
Yeah, like growing lambs, you wouldn't expect really good performance of it, because it is the energy value, the ME value of it decreases as the plant matures. But you could use it for like weaned fit ewes later on in the year when you're not expecting too much from them. You would want to watch out for feet issues and things. Sometimes the longer grass can cause feet issues if they're prone to feet issues. I know probably some more native breeds are less prone to that, but yeah, it can be used for stock with low demand.
Yeah, Liz, any?
And just sometimes it's quite important to think about the types of fields that you're shutting up and the timing. So both Poppy and I are a big fan of deferred grazing. As we mentioned, that's sort of generally August onwards, and a lot of the time that plant has already gone through its flowering stage, so it's not necessarily going to chuck up another flowering stem, so it will just accumulate material over that autumn. So yeah, it's partly to do with timing, and also the types of grasses. So sometimes, particularly fields with a lot of perennial ryegrass, they tend to layer, which means as they grow higher, they tend to fall over. So just to have a think about it, tends to work better on more permanent type swards than it would do on new lays, just because it also might affect their sort of performance next year. And in terms of to try and get that utilization with sheep would be a form of relatively tight blocks, or if you're that keen, strip grazing it just to get that utilization up. But yeah, in terms of the forage analysis coming off it, is be good hay-ish, poorish silage, poor to medium quality silage, so it can certainly do a really good job in that even early pregnancy, mid-pregnancy stage for sheep.
Brilliant, that's great, thank you. We've just got just over sort of 10 minutes left, so if there are any other questions, do keep them coming in. One question that had been asked away from this meeting but somewhere else was about someone wanting to move towards mob grazing, and when they should start that. Is it something that you would start at sort of now, potentially when you're turning your animals out? Would you try and start it in the middle of the year? What would be your recommendation there?
Who's going first? I mean, ideally, I think you want to start building up covers in the autumn, the year prior to really starting, just so it gives you a bit of chance to build things up before you get going, perhaps with turnout. But I mean, as long as you can give opportunity for the grass covers to build, I don't think it particularly matters at the start what time of the year. You might need to do destock or reduce stocking pressure in the short term just to build up those covers.
And I think some people would use, so pasture cropping is sometimes used to help that, or using a forage rye or a Westall type grass to build up the sheer amount of volume of material early in the season. can help. But for me, it still comes back to what the objective of why you're doing that on certain fields. And I know that isn't related to timing, but it can be something to do with how that's being managed and and the best time. But I agree with Pot. It's when is the most appropriate time to build cover, and that tends to be coming out of the winter into spring, but coming out of the winter with a reasonable amount already. So you're not growing from sort of 3 to 4 centimeters. You're already bringing quite a bit through.
Yeah, I can imagine you'd be sort of chasing your tail quite a lot if you try to start in the spring, particularly if it's a late spring. You'd struggle. Yeah.
Liz, did you want to answer the question that Chris had put in about strip grazing, the deferred grazing? I
accidentally did it wrongly on the Q&A. So yeah, in terms of so the question from Chris is about strip grazing, the deferred grazing. A lot of the time people would be doing blocks just because it's easier and shifting them every few days, but certainly you could strip graze deferred grazing if the option's there. That's the joy. It's quite flexible, and obviously the more fencing and time you put into it, the greater the utilization. It's in a way like any of those systems, it's then water provision comes in, fence, all of the infrastructure is the important bit.
We've had a question from Ali, and this is something that I'm really conscious of, given the 60 days of snow that we've had on the ground here. But Ali's asking about, when do you start planning winter for next year? And when do you start thinking about your post-topping covers for 21-22? When does it get too late? Probably when you're in winter and you've got no grass, I would imagine.
Yeah, now.
Yeah. Poppy?
Yeah, midsummer, I would say. So July, August time, you're starting to look out ahead. I mean, you kind of get to, thinking of breeding stock farms, you're going to get to your sort of peak of demand sort of then, and then your demand's starting to tail off as you're perhaps offloading, finishing lambs and finishing stock. And yeah, it's all about trying to manage, as Liz keeps saying, the supply and demand from then, trying to build covers at that point. Yeah,
I agree, which is with a lot of the people I work with, I'm talking about winter in July and they think I'm insane. Yeah. But in reality, when we get to June, July, we can on certain farms with using nitrogen, or we can, as Poppy said, we can unload stock. We can do things in those next months. By the time we get to September, October, the opportunities to do something that really influences what grass is going to grow like has gone. So you need to preempt it. And the further north you are, I would argue it's June rather than July, just because the autumn's going to come a bit quicker.
Yeah, and this is where your monitoring is useful, monitoring farm average covers. You get your eye in, like I keep saying, like in terms of where you want to be into those months that will see you through.
And I think it's worth a bit. I was actually talking to someone about it today, and it'd be interesting on Poppy's views on it as well, which is for those who are doing mob grazing, higher tall grass grazing type systems. We're talking a lot about sward heights and pasture cover readings and things that involve plate meters that just wouldn't work on those sort of systems. So I am interested, and I certainly don't know the answer, which is how do you monitor those systems to give reassurance that you've got enough coming through? And I'll just be interested in people's thoughts really on the how you do it, because the traditional techniques and tools we would use just aren't applicable.
Yeah, I did a mob grazing course with some of the members will know Tony Quayle back 2 years ago, and the grazing planner that they have, Nikki, you probably use one, the holistic grazing planners is more kind of retrospective. You look at your field by field in terms of your animal days per acre each field is achieved, which is great. But sorry, I'm kind of talking in a roundabout way, but to looking into the future, I guess it's one of those things. Year on year, you improve that you get your eye on the signs and things like that to understand what you can do. But I don't know all the answers. I don't mob graze myself, but it's looking at the indicators yourself on farm and getting your eye on yourself, because you don't have the same tools, do you?
I think, just, it's something that we're doing, and we are by no means any sort of experts, but again, it all just comes back to monitoring and observing, and, it's going to be very different for us with very hardy native breeds who, like I've said before, get fat on fresh air, and with kind of more with commercial continental breeds, it's going to be quite a different story. But yeah, just always observing and I think having faith that actually they can, particularly in the winter, go a bit longer than you maybe think they can. They can really take those covers right down, and you can hold them in on areas, and it's just like you said before about building that rest in. But yeah, kind of going each year, learning and tweaking and adapting and recording as much as possible so that you can plan for the future, but having those contingencies in place.
And is it fair to say there is a bit more wiggle room when it comes to mob grazing than perhaps our more short rotation grazing? I'm inclined to think there is. I don't know if that's fair.
In what way do you mean?
Like, if you graze too tight because you're running out of feed supply, you're not leaving the residuals that are, the books you should be going by the book. You're not, you're still keeping those animals alive. You're just not doing things the idealistic way, aren't you? Whereas if we do that, under a standard short rotation, we might end up struggling.
Yeah, definitely. And I think there's that the reflection of like you say, you're still keeping them going. And I think something particularly just coming out of winter, and maybe I'm still scarred by the amount of snow that we've had and how stressful it was. But talking to people who have studied this sort of stuff in Canada, where they just expect their animals to lose 150 kilos over winter. And that's just, they just expect that, that just will happen, and they build that into their planning so that when they're seeing animals getting a bit thinner, it's not kind of really panicking them, because that's the expectation. I can see that Alex Tomlinson's in the call, who'd probably be much better placed to talk about this. And I know it's an area of interest for her, but so maybe we'll have to do another webinar with Alex talking about some of that.
Can I just pick up on that? So I think Poppy, I agree, there's a bit more, there always feels like there's a bit more resilience because there's more stuff somewhere. And that sounds, I don't mean it's stuff, but there's more covers elsewhere, and then they've built up somewhere else. And are in the sort of traditional system would be possibly in a silage heap or a hay barn or whatever. But I think we can build resilience into our system, but we'd have to do more monitoring, or we're obsessed, I know, but is that we can possibly, this is when the debate properly starts, we've only got 3 minutes left, it's about where is that production coming from, isn't it, and where is it growing in the year, and how are you capitalizing on that maximum growth? And we are just doing it slightly differently. It doesn't mean that either one is right or wrong, it's just different approaches, and what are the best ways to just build resilience into those systems. And I think we could, as some mob grazers do, which is some do short rotation type grazing, and some people who do short rotation grazing do some mob grazing. So they're techniques, and it's adapting them to the most appropriate system and animals.
Yeah, and switching things in over the winter, like holding them in bale pods and keeping them in one place, and it's that resilience comes out of being able to be flexible and to have a plan and to change things and being able to adapt as necessary. So yeah, people who are mob grazing aren't necessarily mob grazing all year round. They're going to be switching that up as they come into the winter and thinking that they need to hold animals in particular places, and using them to manage the impact in different ways. We have just got 2 minutes left, and you did mention monitoring. So Ed's question is a good one, which is, what software would you suggest to monitor grass to highlight pinch points throughout the year?
I just have a really simple Excel sheet that I would use. So it's, I think it's done on HDB, which is the feed budget. So I would just use something similar to that. I'm happy to send email. If he emails me, I can email it back to him, and just that plots the number of animals, what you think your grass growth is, and just gives you an indication of where those pinch points may be, and also gives you something to track against. Really simple. Poppy we all love FarmAx too, which is an NZ program, but I don't know whether Poppy wants to add to that.
Absolutely, I've stolen your spreadsheet, Liz. Yeah,
I have to send you a new one. I found an error.
Oh, okay. If you can send me a new one, that'd be great. But yeah, I'm a big advocate of FarmAx as well. The spreadsheet's excellent. It's simple, and you predict your covers. The one thing we struggle to do in a spreadsheet is monitor how grass responds to overgrazing and undergrazing, and that's where something a little bit more sophisticated like FarmAx comes in, which is also a level up as well. So yeah, I don't want to sound like I'm promoting it, but yeah, it's a good piece of software.
Yes, but yeah, start with your Excel sheet. If you get giddy, head to Farmax.
Right, let's finish up. So from each of you, what's your top 3 tips in terms of grazing strategies and grazing management as we go into the year? Who
goes first? Should we do one each? We'll take it in turns.
Because we'll steal each other's. Okay.
Exactly.
I say remember your objectives, as we keep referring to now. Is your objective, are you keeping an eye on animal performance and all the rest, or are you thinking longer term? I would say that's your first and foremost. And I see people fall down when they forget that.
Mine is sort of linked to that, which is don't allow your grazing system to boss you around. A lot of people become a slave to it, and actually it's a tool and a technique to get you to your objective. And that, we all seen people who start off rotational grazing and want to move fences, lots of fences every day, and they quickly learn different techniques because they're not getting the return of investment of the time they're committing to it. So they might put up more permanent electric fences, or they might shift the amount of times they move, but don't let it boss you around.
Yeah. I would say be flexible. I've seen people fall down because they've had too rigid grazing plans, and then there's been nothing in front of the animals. So you've got to make sure you're looking at the signs and have your contingency plans up at the ready.
Mine would be followed on by just visit people. There's a great community of people out there that are really willing to share the bad bits and the good bits. And I think, the amount, the stuff I've learned is from talking to other people. So get that support network. I know it's not been that easy in the last year, but there's a big support network out there. So just to find those people that you sort of run similar systems to you and have a chat with them.
Last one, Poppy.
Okay. I don't know if I'm repeating myself. Keep an eye on the future. It's always a balancing act, trying to make sure they've got the best nutrition now, but also that your future stock aren't going to be sacrificed. The future performance isn't going to be sacrificed. And so that's, looking at residuals and in that way. So yeah, hopefully that's not too vague.
And mine would be similar-ish to that, which is sort of thinking it as a system. So whether it's holistic planning or at a system level, I'm doing a bit of work with people at the moment who probably have a slight misbalance in sheep to cattle. And actually just think about it. Yes, there's a profitability angle, but also what's doing best for the finishing lambs and the grass. So if possible, just take a bit of a step back, and that's where Farmax or something like that sits and just gives you a bit of an oversight of what you're trying to achieve from that farm. And actually, could you reduce your sheep numbers and potentially make more money because you're not putting quite so many inputs in or doing so? Yeah, I think it's about challenging systems.
Brilliant. Both of you, thank you so much for your time this evening. It's been fascinating and time has flown by, and we've now gone past 7 o'clock, so we do have to finish, but I really appreciate your input. It's been really great to hear all of your advice and your ideas. Thank you to all of our participants for coming along and for submitting your questions. And I do just want to say that if you've got ideas for other webinars, I've already got one now brewing in the back of my head as the question and the input from Alex around ideas to do with managing cattle in a slightly different way, then feel free to email me. So it's Nikki, NIKKI @pfla.org.uk if there are particular webinars that you would like to see us put on. Always keen to get those organised. So yeah, thanks everybody. Have a lovely rest of your evening, and hopefully see you soon.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.